We can't rule out the possibility of Rice and Caicedo at Arsenal, but Chelsea, I would expect, are going to be there as well.
That makes a lot of sense. The other player you mentioned already is Declan Rice, and I'll read a passage here from, I think, the Telegraph this morning, who have stated that West Ham know Declan Rice will not sign a new contract, and they are trying to maximise what they can get for him. Some sources state they are looking for as much as £150 million for Declan Rice. Arsenal have been leading the race for many months, but will a deal be found between the two clubs? In terms, this very much feels, West Ham, the way the press have been pushing this, United getting involved, the Bayern Munich links. How much truth is in that? Are Arsenal the front runners? And how much do you believe that this deal can or will be done for?
I think Arsenal are the front runners for sure, and they have been for quite some time. And that's because, as I revealed, I think now back in December even, Rice would prefer to stay in London. So the fact that Thomas Tuchel has joined Bayern and is a big admirer does add a suitor for sure. Bayern's interest is real, but I don't see them competing with a Premier League offer. So as long as Arsenal feel like the valuation is market value, within what usually is quite a strict Arsenal model, as we also saw with Mudryk, they'll move. And I think there's a very strong likelihood that they sign the player because he's a top priority. The thing that's going to complicate things is just if somebody else puts an offer on the table that matches West Ham's public, if you like, valuation, because David Moyes has said that the player's a British transfer record. And that's when Arsenal might be Arsenal and decide that they're not prepared to rock their discipline and their model in order to proceed. But as long as Rice is available for what Arsenal consider to be value, then they'll absolutely move. And Declan Rice has spoken glowingly about Arsenal, which is why I think that this one stands a very strong possibility of happening. What will the number be? Well, as I've reported many times, Arsenal feel like they will not have to pay in excess of 100 million for Declan Rice. And when West Ham was struggling, this was 2-3 months ago, and it looked like they were in a relegation battle and there was no guarantee that they would be able to qualify for Europe. Now, of course, they might through their game against Fiorentina, but 3-4 months ago, nothing was definite. At that point, suitors were thinking 75 to 80 million might do it for Rice. Now they might have to go a little bit higher. West Ham are in a slightly stronger bargaining position, but the initial offer that Arsenal are discussing and preparing internally will be below 100 million. And then it's just going to be a case of who's bluffing. Are Arsenal prepared to go to or in excess of 100 million, or are West Ham quoting sky-high figures? And the Enzo Fernandez deal has clearly complicated things and inflated the market because suddenly there's a player out there that's a similar kind of profile or position anyway to Declan Rice. And there's Chelsea, who paid 121 million euros for a British transfer record. So this is why David Moyes is saying it has to be a like-for-like fee. But there is a big difference between the two, because with Enzo Fernandez, the market value was half what Chelsea paid. So they chose intentionally to pay crazy money because they desperately wanted the player. There was demand, there was urgency, and January, of course, is far more of a seller's market. And then on top of that, it was just one of those sort of freak scenarios whereby there was so much stubbornness from Rui Costa and Benfica that Chelsea really had no choice if they wanted the player. They had to pay well above the odds and hope the player grows into the price tag. But if you're comparing them like for like in value, not in release clause or circumstance, but value, then you'd have to say Declan Rice is way more expensive than Enzo Fernandez, but Enzo Fernandez's market value was actually much closer to 60 million quid.
Yeah.
So if Rice goes for 80 million, 90 million, then value-wise, that's like for like. You can't just take a release clause that doesn't exist in Rice's contract and then say it has to be equivalent to Enzo Fernandez, who did have that release clause, and you have to factor in the contract situation. So it is true that West Ham have got the option to extend Rice's contract by 1 year, which allows them to look at time on the contract as being a little bit longer. And again, factor that in and add a bit more value. But to simply say, just because Chelsea paid well above the odds and crazy money due to Benfica, due to need, and due to that release clause, and to say that Rice, who doesn't have that release clause, should just be like for like, to me is not logical within a market, especially not a summer market, which leans more towards being a buyer's market than a seller's market. So I think that in the end, it's not going to be about the number, but the structure. If it's 100 million, then from Arsenal's point of view, they'll make sure that 100 million is leaning towards being made through add-ons and bonuses. And if it's under 100 million, which is still the expectation from Arsenal and other suitors, then they may have to pay a lot more of that upfront.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and I think there's a few people in the comments saying, because there's some breaking news that's just come out while you were talking. It seems to be always the way that Declan Rice's father, Sean, who is his agent as well, has spoken to Manchester United. That's come from a West Ham source. Their website and their podcast is actually quite a good name. Actually, it's called Claret and Hugh. I think it's a very, very good name for a podcast. Have stated that, and look, to your point, Jamie, in the comments, why would he be talking to Man United if he wants to stay in London? Listen to what Ben said. Preference is to stay in London. That doesn't mean he cannot be swayed by a move to Manchester, especially if Man United are the only team, as an example, that meet the valuation of Man City. If Man United, of West Ham. If West Ham, we bid 110 million and Arsenal only offer 90 million and our bid's accepted and Declan Rice wants to leave, he may go, right, well, I am happy to go to Manchester. I'd love to stay in London. You've got to be very careful in terms of how you interpret these things. I know we all want the transfer news to be the best. It's funny because when we do transfer stories a lot on the Terrace, and whenever it's news that rivals, for instance, don't like hearing about the other clubs, they call it fake news, lies, clickbait. Not one comment on the Mason Mount personal terms agreed video, because rivals were basking in the glory that you were getting Mount, and they're not going to be getting him. So you'll be very careful that you don't just react to things because you're not hearing what you want to hear. Man United are in talks with them as well. Man United are involved with Declan Rice, but as Ben said, Arsenal are leading that race as it stands right now. And I think, as Prime pointed out here, transfers are not easy and as simple as they seem to get done and over the line. There's so many moving parts that you have to factor in, which is why bullet point journalism, in my opinion, is bad for the transfer window, because you're never given the nuance, the toing and the throwing and the difficulties. It may be less sexy, but bullet point journalism is not good. Terry,
Also, I think I would just add to that briefly. First of all, I would be staggered if Manchester United spend the lion's share of their budget on a midfielder rather than a striker. If they got Declan Rice, brilliant, it would be celebrated. I don't think we can entirely rule it out, because any top player available on the market, clubs will look at. But I would be absolutely staggered if Manchester United spent 100 odd million, or even if it's less than 100 million, brought in Mason Mount for 60 million. So 2 midfielders, different kinds of midfielders. Then it almost entirely rules out the option from a budgetary point of view, even with new ownership, of any kind of flagship number 9. And I think that number 9 remains the priority. So it's a balance really for Manchester United between different targets. And if Eric Ten Hag puts all of his budget on 2 different kinds of midfielders, if Mount comes off and then if they move for Declan Rice, it doesn't leave really anything in the kitty. So that, I think, is one thing to bear in mind with Rice, but let's see how that one progresses. It's still relatively early stages. And then listen, with the bullet point journalism that you say, I'm very upfront about this in every single window. If you want the day-to-day, things change. And that is just the nature of a wild transfer window. It's never the case of, this is the only target we're looking at, this is the exact amount we're going to pay, it's going to be a done deal, it's 100% done, and there'll be no twist. It's always a case of multiple suitors. It's always a negotiation. There's always twists and turns. Look at Messi, for example. Everyone else reported there was a verbal pact between PSG and Messi. I actually said at the time that there wasn't, and that the Messi camp had indicated that they were willing to talk to PSG, but zero details had been discussed. And PSG was staggered. They were surprised pleasantly, but they were staggered by this notion that Messi had signed or was going to sign. And then as soon as we got into January, before any talks had even happened, we were told that Messi was about to sign. And again, PSG were like, wait a minute, we haven't even discussed the details. And now, flash forwards, the twist is obviously that Messi is not going to re-sign at PSG, despite optimism, and that it might be Saudi Arabia. And Barcelona have got their whole media arm creating smoke and mirrors, but they've not placed a formal offer. And everything's like this. It's the same with Mount, that of course there's a high probability he'll leave. And of course Manchester United are working on it. But who's to say that Mount won't have coffee this morning with Mauricio Pochettino and a new thought will be placed in his mind? And I think it's just important that we as journalists want to give you black and white 100%. But when it's not black and white, it's irresponsible to jump ahead of the process. So if that means on certain stories being a bit more on the fence, it's because the player themselves might be on the fence or the club themselves might be on the fence. So we can be categorical with certain things, like Brighton bid today for Colwell and Chelsea don't want to sell. As I reported 2 months ago, they won't sell, they won't loan. He's coming back to Chelsea in the summer. Brighton can shout and scream until they're blue in the face. Chelsea will not accept a permanent offer for Colwell. And the only thing that can be a twist in that is Levi Colwell banging on the door of Todd Boehly and Behrad Eghbali and saying, I want to leave. And if you don't let me leave, I'm going to throw my toys out the pram all season. Yeah. But, you know, the likelihood there is that Chelsea's position will be respected by Brighton and other suitors. And come pre-season, Levi Colwell will be back at Chelsea and Mauricio Pochettino will try and integrate him. So social media can be good because you can get bite size of direction of travel, but the context is vital during a window because things are simply ever changing.
I hear that completely. And for me, that's what's exciting about it. I don't understand what maybe they're younger, maybe they're older. I don't know why people, I just enjoy it. Even when my team misses out, it's like, oh, that was still a good ride. Etc. But there we go.